Good evening. I am Major Nathan Burr, the Secretary to General Staff for the 34th Infantry Division. To all our distinguished guests here tonight, on behalf of Brigadier General Kemper, Brigadier General Schemenauer, and the rest of our command team, welcome to the division headquarters.
My name is Bill STRUSINSKI, and I am a Vietnam Army veteran, and I'm a proud member of the Minnesota Military Museum Board. As a veteran, I can honestly tell you that it's about damn time we have our own museum. Hooah! My job tonight is to brief you on the capital campaign and the new museum design work already completed. We're in the midst of a $33 million capital campaign. To date, we've secured $18 million in public and private support. Like so many others, we're eagerly awaiting the passage of a bonding bill at the state legislature, which didn't pass one last year, but we're hopeful they'll have one soon this year. The House and Senate bills did, I think, we're pretty well convinced, included another $10 million for the museum in the bills. These additional funds are needed because of the post-pandemic dramatic increase in construction costs, and you all know that. Further, the museum is seeking $5 million from private donors. Our construction objective is to break ground next spring. This rounds out our $33 million capital campaign. We deeply appreciate the partnership and the strong working relationship we have with the Minnesota Department of Military Affairs and, of course, the Minnesota Department of Veterans Affairs. We look forward to collaborating with all of you, and we are committed to communicating our progress throughout this process, as evidenced tonight by our mission statement gathering. Moving forward, we will make every effort to keep Minnesota's more than 300,000 veterans informed of our progress. Together, all of us will open a new 40,000 square foot facility on 32 acres of land just outside the walls of Camp Ripley, adjacent to the Veterans Cemetery. And our goal is to open in the spring of 2025.
I'm Rick Nash, former Minnesota State Adjutant General and a longtime museum board member. Thankfully, I can tell you that I've already witnessed Minnesota's mobilizing to make this facility happen. Tonight's gathering here at this beautiful headquarters is a testament to that. I appreciate the warm welcome from Major Burr, and it's great to see so many friends and supporters of our new museum here this evening. Within this new museum, there's also a larger footprint for the General Vesey Gallery, which will show other 3D artifacts, documents, publications, books, and really the history of General Vesey over 46 years, being the 10th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Ronald Reagan. General Vesey, ever the proud Minnesotan, took the time to attend ceremonies for the USS Minneapolis St. Paul submarine in its day. That nuclear-powered Los Angeles-class submarine was in service between 1984 and 2008. It was the first vessel of the United States Navy to be named for the Twin Cities metropolitan area. The submarine served with distinction in Operation Desert Shield and the First Gulf War. This new museum is committed to representing all service branches, and one way to illustrate this is in the recent acquisition of the subsail and the rudder. And by working with the Governor's Office, the Navy League, and others, the United States Navy released these pieces to us just last month, narrowly averting its loss to a recycler. Anderson Trucking Service in St. Cloud mobilized to transport these important pieces of Minnesota and naval history back to Minnesota. Incredibly, this was done without charge, by way of 4 lowboy trailers transporting these pieces from Bremerton, Washington Naval Yard to Camp Ripley. The museum is proud to be partnered with Steve Hunnigs and the Jewish Community Relations Council in development of our World War II Liberators Initiative. And so we're very appreciative for the JCRC and their work with Randall, highlighting the liberators of the Holocaust camps. Also, the museum is honored to be thought of by Al Moeller. Al has a display right outside the front door with a small fraction of his collection. And so he's looking to have a facility to house his one-of-a-kind, very unique World War II collection, and it spans unbelievable personalities throughout World War II of Allies and European and the Pacific. And we look forward to working with Al. So Al, we can't thank you enough.
Good evening. I'm Larry HERKE, and I'm the Commissioner of Minnesota Department of Veterans Affairs. I'm also a proud member of the board, which actually predates my time as Commissioner with MDVA. Just 3 days ago, we remembered the 21st anniversary of 9/11. Governor Walz and I use this as an opportunity to remind our state's 48,000 veterans that have served since 9/11. And I've been on a personal vendetta here to make sure that I can get everyone that is eligible for that signed up. So if you are someone that's served within the last 20 years and spent time on active duty, please come and see me. If you know someone and like to pass along a card, come and see me and I'll do that too. The service bonus is in line with what was paid to veterans for previous conflicts going all the way back to World War I and follows the work of MDVA's 9/11 and Global War on Terrorism Task Force. We had a task force of folks that helped me do the remembrance over the last couple of years here. All this work is aligned closely with the work of the Minnesota Military and Veterans Museum. For instance, when veterans complete their online service bonus application, they can immediately share their images and stories of their service directly with the museum through a link that's provided. And they should know that that will become part of the permanent archive for the actual new museum. The museum's post-9/11 traveling exhibit debuted last September at the Cedar Street Armory in St. Paul. It was on view also at the Veterans Hall in Duluth in May, and just recently, in fact, so recent was this last weekend, it was at the Minnesota State University, Mankato, my alma mater. During this past weekend, it was set up there and then brought immediately up here for your viewing. The traveling exhibit, if you haven't seen it yet, is on the drill floor here in the armory, and we strongly encourage you to check it out this evening. Among the many items includes the flight suit of Colonel Patricia Baker, who is here. The Distinguished Service Cross for First Lieutenant Andrew Bunderman is also there. The dress uniform of 4-star General Joseph Votel is there, and you'll also want to definitely hear from Jeff Rosenthal's story from 9/11. The accompanying Resolute documentary was broadcast statewide last year and has been nominated for an Upper Midwest Regional Emmy Award. We also just completed a 12-minute video segment of the Minnesota Stories from Kabul last August. These accounts by Lieutenant Colonel Helgestad, who is here, right here in the middle of the room, Captain Cochran, Lieutenant Swanson, and Ambassador Wilson can be viewed here on the drill floor, and it's also available on the museum's YouTube page. Relevance for a museum is a watchword, and the ongoing work to document the experiences and contributions of Minnesota's post-9/11 veterans is something that we take very seriously and we take pride in. Moving forward, the museum will extend the traveling exhibit tour, offer opportunities for interested individuals to accompany us on a ground zero trip to New York City, and work is also underway to draft the definitive history of Minnesota in America's longest war. This exhibit will have a permanent home in 2025 as a dedicated gallery in the space in the new 40,000 square foot facility. I believe that veterans of every age were challenged by the evacuation of Afghanistan and how it unfolded last fall. Veteran resiliency is central to the work of our department, the Department of Military Affairs, and I believe tough and challenging topics like this should be discussed openly. Not unlike other earlier conflicts, Minnesotans were the first boots on the ground back in October of 2001. And of course, they are among the last to leave 20 years later. Tonight, we are joined by the accomplished author and Marine veteran Elliot Ackerman. He joins us tonight.
I work as a journalist too, and so have also covered wars. And every war that I have ever shown up to, when I've arrived, I've thought that I showed up late. So I arrived in Iraq in 2004, and the war had happened in 2003. I actually remember being in Fallujah in that battle in November of 2003, and we had guys with us who'd been in the invasion, or sorry, that battle was in 2004. We had guys who had been in the invasion in 2003. And I remember being in the house 3 days into the battle, very intense day, and there was the staff sergeant. He's like, well, sir, back in the war. And I was like, what the hell is this? So every war that I've shown up to, I've shown up thinking I got there late. But now when you tell someone, oh, you were in Iraq in 2004, or you were in Afghanistan in 2008, it's like saying, I was in Nam in 65, and I've realized that I was actually there pretty early. So it's always very difficult to situate yourself on the timeline of a war that is ongoing, and particularly in the case of a war like Afghanistan, a 20-year war. So I showed up in 2008, the war had been going on for 7 years. How could you possibly fathom that in many respects you were actually there in the early days?
And you deployed 5 times, but you loved being a soldier.
I did. I loved being a Marine. I loved being an infantry officer, and then later a special operator. Yeah, absolutely. And
you had made the observation amidst all of those stories that go with those deployments in conversation, observing how the Afghan population responded, that you can't win a war using plywood. You have to use concrete to win wars, and the U.S. response was often to use plywood when a better response to convey the permanence of our commitment might have been to use concrete.
Well, I think so. If at any time in our war in Afghanistan or even our wars in Iraq, you had shown up to many of the major headquarters, and specific to Afghanistan, like if you showed up in Bagram or you showed up in Kandahar, something that a person might note is that these headquarters buildings that existed for years at this point were all made out of plywood. Like we never, I just saw your beautiful facility that you're building. There was never sort of this intentionality in our effort that, we're going to build something that's really going to last. And that plywood, it really spoke to a short-term psychology that we brought to this war. That, we're just going to be here for a minute, within, 12 months, 18 months, we're going to be gone, so why bother building in concrete or in steel? Whereas, I lived on a number of bases that the Soviets had occupied. The Soviets, they built in steel and in concrete. The British, the same. I remember being on certain patrols in Afghanistan where I was, driving in the desert and there was a low rubbled wall, and the Afghan I was with grabbing me and be like, see that? Alexander the Great. So, he wasn't building in plywood. And the Afghans would say to me, like, as the pallets of plywood would float in, that they'd say, this is sort of no way to fight a war. So for me, it's less the material plywood, but it speaks to a certain psychology and a certain irony, which is that a short-term psychology in a war can, in many respects, lead you to fight a very, very long war. And this isn't new. I imagine there are probably some Vietnam veterans in the audience. In the Vietnam War, it was often said that the problem with Vietnam wasn't that we fought a 7-year war, is that we fought 7 one-year wars. And I think you could very much say the same thing about Afghanistan. Like, yes, at face value, 20 years is a really long time to fight a war. But at any point in that 20-year timeline, we were anywhere between 12 to 18 months from a major troop drawdown. And again, the psychology around wars really matter as to the outcome of the war.
And where were you entering 2021? Were you still in the service at that point?
No, I was living a very different life. So I left. I was on active service from 2003 until 2011. And in 2011, I left. At the time, I worked for CIA. I was a paramilitary officer there. But I really sort of viewed my service as sort of an 8-year contiguous period of time. And then I transitioned out into a career as a writer. So in many ways, I had made my peace with the fact that the war had ended for me in 2011. I still had friends who had served for years afterwards. Probably like many veterans here, I had friends who were killed afterwards, which was very complicated, just emotionally, to know that you had left the war and buddies of yours were still fighting and dying there. But by and large, and by 2021, I had moved on to my post-war life.
Which included a family and vacations.
Right. So, I mean, when I'll never forget where I was when Kabul fell. I was actually in my mother-in-law's kitchen in Florida, getting ready to go on vacation on August 15th. And then we grabbed our kids. We actually had a very long-standing, our 2-week family holiday at the end of the summer. We were going to Italy. So we were about as far away as a person can be from Afghanistan as the fall was occurring. And I write about that in the book. And I think it's important to put some of those details in the book, not because I think any reader really cares about my family vacation in Italy, but because I wanted to show the psychological juxtaposition of watching a war end and the way it sort of sucks you back into its gravitational pull with the life I was trying to live away from the war.
So tell us about your vacation. No. Or lack of vacation, your night versus your day.
So, so as we're preparing to leave, again, I make my way in this world as a writer and as a journalist. So I have had many friends who had covered the war and had experienced Afghanistan, not necessarily as service members, but working for various newspapers. And my network is sort of lighting up as they are trying to get their Afghan colleagues out. Also, as a veteran, my Afghan friends, many of whom by now, because again, this is 10 years ago we were all fighting in Afghanistan, have since settled in the United States, but they have family who are in Afghanistan who they need to evacuate, who are under threat from the Taliban. So my entire network is lighting up, and I think the first note I got, understanding that people were trying to just sort of in an ad hoc way get people out, was from a friend of mine who was a journalist, and I said, hey, I hear you might have a way to get some people out because my interpreter's family needs help. And he said, yeah, but I need your help. I'm like, well, what can I do for you? He's like, well, I need to raise $250,000 in a hurry for a private jet. I was like, well, okay, I don't have $250,000, but let's sort of start talking about how we're gonna get this together. And so what very quickly assembled was really an ad hoc group of people, a crowdsourced evacuation, with everyone sort of playing their respective position in that. It's from people who were doing fundraising to people who were, building these manifests of Afghans who were trying to get to the airport, to colleagues of mine who were on the ground, who were journalists, who were renting buses to stage at hotels and try to drive into the airport, to another friend of mine who had he'd written a book about the Taliban and had very good contacts within the Taliban. He was negotiating as they came into Kabul with the various police chiefs in the district, the Taliban police chiefs, so that our convoys could pass through. My job in this sort of group of journalists is really the one with probably the best military and intelligence Rolodex was, well, I think I could get some people into the airport. So that's how I started spending my days, was this effort, this crowdsourced effort, with most of the action taking place, on your cell phone, on apps like WhatsApp and Signal.
In your comment, you said, my job. It was your job. You inherited that job, you took on that job, it became your responsibility, arguably because some others maybe weren't doing that. You stepped forward, and many others like you, that's what you did. That was that digital Dunkirk, was you needing to step up and fill a gap that was there. And
certainly. I mean, listen, if there had been an email address or a phone number that in good conscience any one of us could have passed to an Afghan who had served their government but also our government, said, call this number, email this person, they're going to help you, then I think I would have been very happy to go about my business. The problem was there was no process in place. That's not to say that the soldiers and Marines and State Department personnel that were at the airport were doing an absolutely heroic effort. They were, but there was a broader strategic failure that was just in extremely stark relief in those days.
I mean, you called it a collapse.
Collapse is the word that I have used for those weeks. And I think it was a collapse on many levels. It was a collapse of American competence, and I think we saw that in the images coming out of the airport, as well as a collapse of American morals, at least according to me, our ideals that we purport to uphold, as we are just leaving our allies behind, leaving behind people who we made promises to. For me, it was a collapse of time, because suddenly, I had made my peace with the fact that I had left the war 10 years beforehand. I'm in a different profession. I've got a family that didn't exist when I was in the wars, and now suddenly I am living the war as I lived it 10 years before. Actually, for my wife, who wasn't with me when I was in the service, it was like she had suddenly been given a window into an entire different life that I had had. And friends of ours who are sort of, my vet buddies, but she and my kids just know them as our friends, suddenly we're all kind of back in doing the same work together that we once did. So it was this interesting collapse of time. And then the last portion where I would say was a collapse, it was a strange collapse of hierarchy. Because as this collapse was occurring, it didn't care whether or not, the Afghan, it didn't care whether or not you had been a corporal or a 4-star flag-ranked officer. Nobody could get their people out. And so I found myself in some very surreal, signal chats with very senior officers who were trying to navigate their interpreters into the airport.
And during that time, you also had interactions with Vietnam veterans, and I think in the book you suggest there was a sense of pity that you almost felt coming from them, because they understood something that you were still coming to terms with, perhaps.
Yeah, Randall, no, it wasn't in that time that there was this, well, I'm a journalist too, so I'm actually contemporaneously, so during the days on this sort of 2-week window, my wife, who in the book I think sort of comes off as sort of the moral center of the book. She's the one who can sort of see the forest through the trees and is basically saying, this is so crazy that this is happening like this. Like, can't you, almost like I'm someone who's spent most of his life in a sort of dysfunctional relationship, and you need someone who's outside of it to say, like, hey, this isn't right. Like, you guys shouldn't be needing to do this. But so during the days, we were trying to spend time with our children. At nights, we would be staying up all nights working on these evacuations, which, oh, by the way, is what everybody was doing. My experience is by no way unique. And I was also, as a journalist, writing, here and there columns about it and trying to talk about it, because I felt that was important. And as I was sort of thinking about this experience, I started thinking about the Vietnam guys. And I just bring that up in the context of, because so much of this was being compared, right, to Saigon. So you have to think about Vietnam. And, you asked me about coming into the service way back in 1998 and being a young man who's thinking about joining the Marines. Well, you look back to the war that came before, and those are the Vietnam guys. And many of those guys had served as mentors for me as I was coming up. But I had always felt in my relationships with the Vietnam guys, there was always just like this little sort of bit of distance that exists between us. Like, they were maybe a little kind of skeptical of us, and it was never a total one-for-one. And I always felt that for years, and I had kind of chalked it up to two things. No ways critical, but I was like, well, maybe the Vietnam guys kind of look at my generation of veterans, and like there was no draft, like we're all volunteers, and a lot of us like keep going back. And maybe they're just like a little skeptical. And I've had one or two sitting like, why do you keep going back? Like, what's wrong with you? I got drafted. And I always thought, like, well, maybe that's part of it. And maybe this little distance I sometimes feel is also because, they're a little more disillusioned than we were. But, I understand that they're children of the 1950s. That was a time of a lot of illusions in America. And so when Vietnam happened, they sort of had further to travel. And, I'm a millennial. Like, you can't disillusion me. I know what's what. So I sort of thought maybe that was a difference. And in those days, I realized I'd been completely wrong. Those conclusions that I've been carrying on for years were wrong. The little distance that existed between me and the Vietnam guys had nothing to do with that other stuff. It had to do with one thing. The Vietnam guys knew how it ended, and I didn't. and it ended with betrayal. And then with us having to turn our backs on all these people and walk away. And so I'm like, what's this little thing that I'm feeling between me and these Vietnam guys? And frankly, what I settled on was like, there's just like a little bit of pity. They're kind of like, I love you, kid. You don't know how it ends yet. Yeah, your war's been going on 20 years, but you don't know how it ends yet. And I do. I saw it. And ever since that, I've sort of felt much more like, I'm relooking at all those relationships. Like, I really feel like I understand these guys in a way that I never did before.
Thank you. We had to turn our backs on people. We did bring thousands out. There's still some work to do to support those thousands that did get out with pending legislation that still needs to be passed. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Listen, we're like a year out from all of this, and there is a bit of a conversation going on about, Afghanistan, but there's also, I think, this tendency to, okay, well, it happened, and now it's time to turn the page. But there's still really important work that needs to happen in this country. So all of the Afghans who managed to get here, and it's about 80,000, they are currently in this country on a humanitarian parole. So without special letters of exception, they're not able to work. Many ARCs, they have those letters, but they have no pathway to stay here and will be deported if their status does not change. So there is legislation right now in the House and the Senate, bicameral, kind of wending its way through, which is the Afghan Adjustment Act, which would give these Afghans that we evacuated the ability to get green cards and put them on a pathway eventually to citizenship. And that is critically important, and I think it's very important that we as a nation not just sort of say, yes, that was tragic and it was horrible and it wasn't our finest hour, but let's move on. And we remember, like, we brought these people here. And these people are not, these people are American heroes. I mean, they might not carry American passports, but so many of them are American heroes. They fought for years alongside us for values we purport to uphold, and they will be an enormous credit to this country. So it's very important that we not forget about the ones that we did bring here at great expense, that we adjust their status, get this legislation passed, and bring them into this country. So that is some of the good that can come out of this.
You had commented in your book, and in interviewing Lieutenant Colonel Helgestad, spoke to a commonality that you both talk about in different ways, but it's compelling. And aside from tactics and strategies, is just an appreciation of the importance of relationships. Relationships are so key to getting those people out, that relationships almost become a weapon, a tool to be used for some purpose. You just comment on the role that relationships played in your service, and especially in Afghanistan last year and to this day?
Sure. Well, I can sort of, the anecdote I will tell you is, as this collapse is happening in Afghanistan, and I'm fielding sort of phone calls from people I have personal relationships with, Afghans who need help. We're trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to get, at least the first evacuation we did was 109 people. So how are we going to get these 109 people into the airport? And we got the buses, they're going to get on the buses, they're going to drive through the Taliban checkpoints. So, okay, I'm going to see who I know at the airport. And I call up a dear friend of mine who's a Marine Infantry Battalion commander with the 2nd Battalion of the 8th Marine Regiment. We were roommates in training and fought in Fallujah together. And he's in Japan. And I call him up, and because it's me, he answers his phone at 3:30. What do you want? I'm like, do you know who's at which Marine units are at the airfield? And he figures out it's actually our old Marine Infantry Battalion from Iraq. The 1st Battalion of the 8th Marine Regiment is one of the battalions that's there. And like, well, do you know who the CO of 1-8 is? He's like, yeah, it's Chris Richardella. And Chris Richardella happened to be in our same IOC Infantry Officer Course class in Quantico 20 years ago. And through a couple more emails, I dig up his cell phone number and I call him. And he answers his phone. And I'm like, are you in Kabul? He's like, yeah. I'm like, I've got these Afghans I'm trying to get. He's like, great, send them to the North Gate. I own the North Gate. And for a period of time, those level of relationships, and you quickly figure this out. Colonel Richardella was there with another Marine Infantry Battalion, and they were nominally under the command of a Marine Expeditionary Unit, which is led by a colonel That colonel had been my commanding officer when he was a major in Afghanistan in 2008. These connections were sort of everywhere with military folks who are working on this. And again, I don't think this is totally unique to my experience. So 2 points kind of, resonated with me in that, in so much as the war, for me, ended on like these very intimate terms, where I'm working with and talking to a bunch of people who I've known for years and are my friends, and I write about that in the book and kind of lay out all of these connections. But the other thing that gave me real pause was, as much as all of us knew one another in Afghanistan, it felt very isolating because so few Americans knew us. And it really put into stark relief that one of the costs of these, forever wars, the war since 9/11, and the way that we fought them, has been an ever-widening civil-military divide. And I think that's something as a nation we really need to reckon with. I think obviously, museums, and I'm just going to say, and culture can do quite a bit to amplify voices and to amplify stories. I think that there's actually a very distinct reason why this civil-military divide exists in this country. So listen, if you go back and look at the history of American warfare all the way back to the Revolution, every war that we have ever fought as a country has needed a construct to sustain it. And what I mean by that is, broadly speaking, wars need to be sustained in two ways: blood and treasure. Who's going to fight the war? How are you going to pay for it? So if we look at constructs like the American Civil War, broadly speaking, the construct of that war was, the first ever draft in this nation as a result of the Civil War, as is the first ever income tax to fund the war. The Second World War was characterized by a national mobilization, war bond drives. The Vietnam War characterized by a very unpopular draft that ultimately leads to an anti-war movement that ends the war. So when 9/11 happens and America mobilizes for war again, there's a construct that's built out around these wars. And that is, they're fought by our all-volunteer military, and they're funded through deficit spending. The last year that we passed a balanced budget in this country was 2001. That's not a coincidence. And if you look, about a quarter of our national deficit you can trace to the war on terror. So when we pay through the national deficit, there's not a war tax, so nobody feels it in their pocketbook. And when it's fought by all volunteers, unless you know someone in the military, have a loved one in the military, or serving yourself, it doesn't really affect you. So the result is many, many Americans are insulated from the costs of these wars. They're anesthetized to them. They don't feel it. So, if you're asking me, why did the war in Afghanistan go on for 20 years? That's the reason it went on for 20 years. And, these wars are sort of coming to a close. But, someday down the line, there will be another war. And our politicians will sort of tell us how the war is going to be fought in the early days. And I think we should be very skeptical of any war where we're told that it's going to be fought, but we're not all going to have skin in the game. If it's worth going to war over something, it's also worth every American having skin in the game. And until Americans do have skin in the game, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to meaningfully bridge that cultural divide. But in the interim, I think cultural institutions, do play a very important role, like these veterans museums. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, listen, I think there's been some fine books written about the wars, and I think there's been some okay movies, not great movies, frankly. And I've sort of asked myself, why do we not have a crop of, I feel like there was a crop of movies that came out of, for instance, the Vietnam War that were, really mainstream in American culture. I mean, I guess, the Hurt Locker won Best Picture, but, Platoon won Best Picture. It was a cultural event. I don't think you've seen that with these wars, but again, I kind of link it to the prior comment of how the wars were fought. If we look back in American history, at least at our recent wars and the ones that are memorialized in this museum, right? The Vietnam War, that was a generationally defining event. My parents are of the Vietnam generation. Second World War, the greatest generation, a generationally defining event. The First World War breeds the lost generation. When I think about my own generation, its engagement with these wars, I don't feel like I'm part of a lost generation. I would say, if anything, as a veteran, I feel like I'm the lost part of a generation. and that these wars were not experienced as generationally defining. And so when it comes to sort of culture and film and other things, it doesn't resonate necessarily the same way. You know, I could get up here, like, you know, pick apart, like, well, I like that book and didn't like this film, but I think that's sort of the larger issue, sort of how we relate to these, you know, to the war and the culture around the war. And I think, you know, one of the reasons we don't relate to it in the same way is just because it didn't define the generation. I think education plays a central role. It's surreal to see your war, kind of my wars, moving into the history books and to see how my children learn about 9/11. So obviously that history is extremely important. On a macro note, and I apologize if this goes outside the scope of the conversation or even your question, you know, listen, I think the greatest national security, you know, and I work as a war correspondent too. I was in Ukraine last week. You know, I think the greatest national security threat that the United States faces today is our own internal dysfunction. And I think a lot of that comes into sort of what we're teaching our children. And you know, we've got to, you know, it's outside the scope of our conversation, but we got to figure out as a country how to get on the same page. Doesn't mean we can't disagree, but we have to at least generally be on the same page, because if we can't do that, we're going to have, you know, very, very big problems if we're ever considering fighting a war against a peer-level adversary again. So let's get our own house in order, and then we can talk about being in a position to, you know, to defend our interests abroad. Listen, I think what's happening in Ukraine right now in the offensive in the Northeast is pretty remarkable, and I think because we are here talking about Afghanistan, I'll say you can drop a plumb line from what happened last summer in Afghanistan to the events 6 months later in Ukraine, because you better believe that as Vladimir Putin was trying to decide whether or not to invade Ukraine, he was weighing what the NATO response would be, and he got a pretty big signal that the NATO response would be feckless and inimical when he watched how NATO pulled out of Afghanistan. So then he invades Ukraine. It's dizzying that I would say one of NATO's darkest moments, which is what happens in Afghanistan, that 6 months later, actually one of its brightest moments, the way it overperforms in Ukraine, occurs in February. So you're seeing real progress in Ukraine. But, you know, why does Ukraine matter so much? I mean, it matters because we care about the Ukrainian people, but it also matters because it comes in the context of, you know, a rise of authoritarianism around the world, like in China and in Taiwan. You know, if Vladimir Putin had steamrolled through Ukraine, we'd be having very different conversations about Taiwan right now. Fortunately, he didn't. But one of the real challenges we have in Taiwan is that the Chinese would be fighting any type of war there in their backyard, and we would be waging it all the way across the Pacific Ocean. But wouldn't it be nice when we think about trying to respond to the Chinese in Taiwan if we had, let's say, I don't know, a couple of strategic air bases in Central Asia that shared a border with China? Well, guess what? We gave those up a year ago. So this all relates, and it's important to consider, you know, not just Afghanistan as a stovepipe, Ukraine as a stovepipe, and China as a stovepipe. You know, we got to be playing chess, not checkers with our adversaries.
Elliot, come back real soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Tonight, we have an amazing guest speaker. We have an amazing guest of lives, all kinds of lives in the room. Let's go out there and talk to each other, build with each other that collective decision. We're going to try to make this museum happen in the way that all our parents and everyone who will have come before them and after them will really be proud of.